In our devotional today, we're going to take a few minutes to look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, where Jesus is saying to his followers that they are supposed to be salt in the world. And so we're going to look at what that might mean and apply that to our own lives today. So let's first look at the passage here, just at verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about salt, I've always understood that passage to talk about adding flavor. You know, when I use salt, I'm putting it on my potatoes. I'm making it to enhance the flavor of a dish that I've cooked, because I oftentimes need that in my own cooking. But more importantly than even the flavor enhancement, what salt in its purest form really is a preservative. So it's first as a preservative and then for flavor. And so what Jesus is saying here is, ultimately, that if you're salt in the world, it means you're preserving God's standards. You're preserving who Jesus was there to represent. He was there to represent God and to teach the people that the way of the world was not the way of what God had intended, and that as his followers that they needed to preserve those standards. And so another way to say that is then that as salt, we are to protect and to represent the standards of God. Now, apply that to yourselves, thinking about your own life and in your friendships and in your families, and think about, have I ever thought about being salt means I preserve God's way, or I protect his ways, I protect his standards, and I represent those in my life? That's a question we want to answer and be challenged by today. I know that's been a challenge for me as I've been working through this. So you might be saying, well, how do you go about protecting God's standards? What exactly are those? And I just thought the 10 Commandments are a good place to start. This was from the Old Testament. Moses goes up on a mountain and God meets him there and he says, write these 10 rules down that we call the 10 Commandments, and tell the people these are just the beginning standards of what they need to do to represent me in their world. And so I kind of wanted to highlight a few of those for us today, for those that would apply to you guys in your life. So one of the 10 Commandments is to not worship anything else, to put no other God before the holy God. Look at your life. Do you have more worship or attention to friendships or to your clothes or to your popularity status? Do you put other things that you worship ahead of God? Consider that. Think about, do you lie and steal? It can be small lies. It doesn't have to be big, major things. Stealing can be little things, but nonetheless, lying and stealing are not things that represent the standard of God. And also not to be jealous. Now, that's a tough one. That's definitely a harder one to live by, but nonetheless, that's one of the standards God's asks of his people, is not to be jealous or envious of what other people have. Not to look at their clothes and the brand names they get to wear, the vacations they get to take, or the car that they drive, and be jealous or envious of that we are called not to be jealous people. One thing that it does say to do is to honor your parents, to make sure you honor their rules, that you honor the ways that they've set up for you. That's part of representing God's standard. So today what I want you to do is I have a couple of questions here. I want us to kind of reflect on this information and think, challenge ourselves to that thought, not to just hear it and say, oh, that's interesting. Salt is a preservative, not just for flavor, but to really look at your own life. For me to look at my own and to say, do I protect and represent the standards of God in this world? So the first question you're going to want to ask yourself is, do you agree that God's ways are different than the world we live today? I think that's an important question to talk about for a few minutes. And then also, what area in your own life could you take the challenge to say, I need to think more about God's standard before I make decisions? So take a few minutes to discuss that today, and let's see how we can be better at being salt in a world around us.